May 27th, 1943. Morning. Outside Tunis, Tunisia, Staff Sergeant William Horvath commanded a gun crew from the 804th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and his men had just finished digging in their 37mm anti-tank gun behind a cluster of olive trees when the radio crackled with an urgent message. German Mark IV tanks were advancing up the coastal road, less than a mile away. The battalion had been fighting in North Africa for 3 months, and Horvath's crew had learned brutal lessons about their weapons' limitations. The 37mm gun they operated weighed 912 pounds, could be manhandled by its 4-man crew, and fired a 2-pound projectile at 2,800 feet per second. Against the light Italian tanks they had encountered in Tunisia during the early fighting, it had performed adequately. Against German armor, it was nearly useless. The Mark IV tank, approaching their position, featured 80mm of frontal armor. Horvath's 37mm gun could penetrate that thickness only at ranges under 200 yards, and even then, only if the shot struck perfectly perpendicular to the armor plate. At combat ranges of 500 to 1,000 yards, where German tank commanders preferred to engage, the 37mm rounds simply bounced off. Horvath had watched this happen twice in the past week. Both times his crew had survived only because they abandoned their position and retreated before the German tanks could close the distance and eliminate them. But this morning, something was different. 2 weeks earlier, the battalion had received word that new weapons were arriving, heavier anti-tank guns, British-designed, already in production for Lend-Lease. The infantry board, back in Washington, had fought against adopting them, arguing they were too heavy at 2,100 pounds, too difficult for infantry units to maneuver, and that the existing 37mm gun was adequate if used properly. The men who had actually faced German tanks in Tunisia disagreed violently with this assessment, and their reports had finally forced the army's hand. Horvath's crew hadn't received one of the new guns yet. They were still using their 37mm, still hoping that somehow this engagement would be different. The German tanks appeared through the dust, 3 Mark IVs moving in loose formation up the road. Horvath calculated the range at 800 yards. His gun couldn't penetrate at that distance. He watched through his binoculars as the tanks advanced, waiting for them to close to 500 yards, then 400, then 300. At 250 yards, he gave the order to fire. The first round struck the lead tank's frontal armor and ricocheted upward with a bright spark. The tank kept moving. The second round hit the same tank's turret and deflected sideways. The German ace commander now knew where Horvath's position was located, and the Mark IV's turret began traversing toward them. Horvath ordered his crew to displace immediately. They abandoned the gun and sprinted toward a wadi 50 yards behind their position as the German tank's 75mm cannon fired. The shell impacted directly where they had been standing 3 seconds earlier, destroying their 37mm gun and scattering equipment across the hillside. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Horvath survived that engagement. His crew survived. But their weapon did not, and, more importantly, their confidence in American anti-tank doctrine was shattered. They had done everything correctly. They had positioned themselves well, calculated the range accurately, aimed precisely, and fired at the optimal moment. The weapon itself had simply been insufficient for the task it was designed to perform. This was the reality facing American forces in Tunisia during the spring of 1943, and it was a reality that Army leadership could no longer ignore. The weapon that would eventually replace guns like Horvath's had actually been in production in the United States since early 1942. The 57mm gun M1 was an Americanized version of the British 6-pounder anti-tank gun, originally developed at Woolwich Arsenal in 1940. The British had designed it specifically to counter German tank development, recognizing as early as 1938 that their existing 2-pounder anti-tank gun would quickly become obsolete as German armor thickness increased. By 1940, British engineers had completed a new gun, with a caliber of 57 millimeters, the same caliber the Royal Navy had used since the late 19th century, which meant manufacturing equipment already existed. The gun featured a 50 caliber barrel, meaning the bore was 50 times its diameter, giving it an overall length of just over 12 feet. It fired a 6.3-pound armor-piercing projectile at 2,700 feet per second from its standard barrel configuration, though the Americans would produce a slightly longer barrel that increased muzzle velocity to 2,800 feet per second. The weapon was mounted on a conventional split-trail carriage with pneumatic tires but without spring suspension, a deliberate choice to keep weight down and manufacturing costs manageable. British production of the 6-pounder had been delayed by the disaster of Dunkirk in June 1940. When the British Expeditionary Force evacuated France, it left behind virtually all of its heavy equipment, including thousands of anti-tank guns. The immediate need to re-equip the army meant Britain continued producing the older 2-pounder gun rather than switching to the new 6-pounder, because it was estimated that every 100 6-pounders produced would displace the production of 600 2-pounders. This decision delayed the 6-pounder's entry into service until May 1942, when it first saw action at the Battle of Gazala in North Africa. The Americans had begun planning to produce the British gun in February 1941, almost a year before the United States officially entered the war. The idea came from U.S. Army Ordnance, which wanted to manufacture the weapon for Lend-Lease to supply British forces. At that time, the American 37mm gun M3 was just entering service in large numbers, and the U.S. Army had no intention of adopting the heavier British weapon for its own use. The gun was classified as substitute standard, meaning it could be used if necessary, but was not the primary weapon for American anti-tank units. 2 British 6-pounder Mark II guns were shipped to the United States as reference models, along with 100 rounds of ammunition. American engineers immediately made modifications to suit U.S. manufacturing practices and capabilities. The most significant change was restoring the longer barrel from the original British Mark I design. Britain had shortened the barrel on their Mark II version because of a shortage of long gun lathes, but the United States had no such shortage and could produce the longer, more powerful barrel without difficulty. Production began in May 1941 at multiple facilities, and the American-made guns were designated as the 57mm gun M1 on carriage M1. The first variants featured American combat tires and wheels, designated M1A1. In September 1942, production switched to the M1A2 variant, which incorporated a free traverse system. This allowed the crew to traverse the gun by pushing and pulling on the breech, rather than relying solely on the geared traverse mechanism. The improvement had been requested by the British, who had adopted the same feature on their newer carriages. By the spring of 1943, American factories were producing the 57mm gun at impressive rates. The total production run would eventually reach 15,637 units between 1942 and 1945, with peak production of 5,856 guns in 1943 alone. But despite this manufacturing success, the weapon faced intense resistance from the very forces that would ultimately have to use it. The U.S. Army Infantry Board, responsible for evaluating and approving equipment for infantry divisions, objected strenuously to adopting the 57mm gun. Their primary complaint was weight. The 37mm gun weighed 912 pounds and could be manhandled short distances by its crew. The 57mm gun weighed 2,100 pounds, more than twice as heavy. Moving it required either a dedicated towing vehicle or a much larger crew, and the Infantry Board believed this loss of mobility outweighed any improvement in armor penetration. The Ordnance Board had the opposite opinion. They felt the 57mm gun was already borderline obsolete, and that an even more powerful weapon should be introduced. They pointed to German tank development, which was producing vehicles with progressively thicker armor that would eventually render even the 57mm gun ineffective. Both the airborne and cavalry branches rejected the weapon outright, the former because it was too heavy for their operations, the latter because it didn't fit their doctrine of mobility and speed, but the men fighting in North Africa had a different perspective. They had faced German Mark III and Mark IV tanks with only 37mm guns for defense, and they knew from direct experience that their weapons were inadequate. After-action reports from Tunisia repeatedly emphasized the same point. American anti-tank guns could not engage German armor at effective combat ranges. German tanks could sit beyond 1,000 yards and methodically destroy American positions with their 75mm cannons, while American 37mm guns couldn't penetrate German armor even at half that distance. The disparity was killing American soldiers, and the soldiers themselves were demanding better weapons. Letters from company commanders, battalion commanders, and division commanders all made the same urgent request. Give us heavier anti-tank guns immediately, before more men die because their weapons can't do the job. These reports reached Washington throughout late 1942 and early 1943, creating pressure that the Infantry Board could no longer resist. In the spring of 1943, following the conclusion of the Tunisia campaign, the Infantry Board officially replaced the 37mm gun with the 57mm gun as the standard anti-tank weapon for U.S. infantry divisions. The decision came on May 26th, and the new Table of Organization was published on May 27, 1943. Each regiment's anti-tank company would receive 9 57mm guns, organized into 3 platoons of 3 guns each. Each infantry battalion would also receive an anti-tank platoon with 3 guns, giving a total of 18 guns per regiment. The introduction was made despite continued objections from the Infantry Board, which still believed the gun was too heavy. The Ordnance Board, still arguing for an even more powerful weapon, accepted the 57mm gun only because it was already in production and could be fielded immediately. The airborne and cavalry maintained their rejection, continuing to use lighter weapons more suited to their operations. This fractured adoption meant the 57mm gun entered American service without the universal support that normally accompanied new equipment, creating uncertainty about its actual combat effectiveness. The uncertainty was compounded by a critical shortage that would plague the weapon throughout its service life. When the 57mm gun was rushed into production for Lend-Lease, ammunition development had focused exclusively on armor-piercing rounds. This made sense for a dedicated anti-tank gun, but it created severe limitations when the weapon was pressed into broader infantry support roles. American factories were producing only armor-piercing ammunition in significant quantities, with no high-explosive or canister rounds available. High-explosive rounds were essential for engaging enemy infantry, fortifications, and soft-skinned vehicles. Canister rounds, filled with small projectiles that scattered like shotgun pellets, were devastating against infantry attacks at close range. Both ammunition types had been standard for the 37mm gun and had proven invaluable in combat. But for the 57mm gun, neither type was in production. When the weapon entered American service in spring 1943, the British had developed a high-explosive shell for their 6-pounder, and American units were forced to acquire British ammunition stocks whenever possible. But supply was limited and inconsistent. Authorization for American production of the M303 T-18 high-explosive shell didn't come until March 1944, and production of the M305 T-17 canister shell didn't begin until January 1945. This meant American units using the 57mm gun throughout 1943 and into 1944 had only armor-piercing ammunition, severely limiting the weapon's tactical flexibility. Despite these challenges, the gun's technical specifications were impressive compared to the weapon it replaced. The 57mm M1 could fire several types of armor-piercing ammunition, each with different performance characteristics. The basic AP shot, designated M70, could penetrate approximately 70mm of armor at 1,600 yards. The more advanced armor-piercing capped ballistic cap round, designated M86 and introduced in early 1943, could penetrate 71mm at 1,000 yards. These penetration figures represented a significant improvement over the 37mm gun, which could penetrate only about 48mm at 1,000 yards. The 57mm gun could engage German Mark III and Mark IV tanks at combat ranges, where the 37mm gun was completely ineffective. It could penetrate the side armor of most German tanks at ranges up to 1,500 yards and the frontal armor of Mark III tanks at ranges up to 1,000 yards. But the gun's performance was heavily dependent on range, angle of impact, and the specific type of armor being engaged. At longer ranges, penetration decreased significantly. The armor-piercing round's effectiveness dropped off rapidly beyond 1,000 yards, making long-range engagements problematic. Against the frontal armor of newer German tanks like the Panther, with its 80mm of sloped armor, the 57mm gun struggled even at optimal ranges. The weapon featured a vertically sliding breech block that could be operated quickly, allowing a well-trained crew to fire up to 15 rounds per minute in short bursts, though sustained fire rates were typically closer to 5 rounds per minute to prevent overheating. The gun could traverse 45 degrees left and right, could be elevated 15 degrees, and depressed 5 degrees. These limits were less than the 37mm gun's capabilities, but were considered adequate for a direct-fire anti-tank weapon. The hydro-pneumatic recuperator system helped mitigate some of the gun's considerable recoil, but crews consistently complained about the violent kick when the weapon fired. The barrel recoiled approximately 30 inches along its cradle immediately after firing, and despite the recuperator system, the gun moved noticeably with each shot. This recoil was significantly harsher than the 37mm guns, and crews required time to adjust to the increased shock. The gun could be fired with its split trail, either deployed or closed, though deployed firing provided better stability. The pneumatic tires allowed the weapon to be towed at speeds up to 35 miles per hour on roads, though cross-country movement was much slower due to the lack of suspension. Without spring suspension, the gun transmitted every bump and obstacle directly to the towing vehicle and the carriage itself, making extended road marches uncomfortable for everyone involved. General George S. Patton's 7th Army would be the first American force to use the 57mm gun in large-scale combat operations. The invasion of Sicily, launched on July 10, 1943, marked the gun's combat debut with U.S. forces. Patton's divisions had received their new weapons in the weeks between the end of fighting in Tunisia and the start of the Sicily operation, giving crews just enough time for basic familiarization, but not enough for extensive training. The Sicily campaign immediately revealed both the gun's strengths and its limitations. Against Italian armor and German Mark III tanks, the 57mm gun performed well, destroying enemy vehicles at ranges where the old 37mm gun would have been useless. But the lack of high explosive ammunition created serious problems. Infantry advancing through Sicilian towns and villages needed fire support against enemy strongpoints, machine gun nests, and fortified buildings. The 57mm guns could only fire armor-piercing rounds, which passed straight through soft targets without creating the explosive blast necessary to neutralize infantry positions. Patton himself noted this limitation in his reports, and his comments reflected the ambivalence that many commanders felt toward the new weapon. He acknowledged that the 57mm gun was superior to the 37mm gun for engaging tanks, but he also noted that the lighter gun's high explosive and canister ammunition had been invaluable during the Tunisia fighting. In his characteristic blunt style, Patton wrote that the 57mm gun was better for killing tanks but worse for killing Germans, and that given the choice, he would prefer a weapon that excelled at both. This assessment would echo through the gun's service history. The 57mm M1 was a dedicated anti-tank weapon, introduced at a time when the U.S. Army needed versatile infantry support guns that could engage multiple target types. It represented a significant improvement in armor penetration, but a step backward in tactical flexibility. And, most critically, it entered service just as German tank development was accelerating, producing vehicles that would test the gun's capabilities to their absolute limit. The real test would come in Italy, where American forces would face some of the most difficult terrain in Europe, and where German defenders would employ their newest and most heavily armoured tanks. In those battles, the 57mm gun would prove both its worth and its limitations, and the men who operated it would learn whether weight and power could compensate for lost versatility in the brutal mathematics of armoured warfare. Part 2. Combat Reality. The Italian mountains tested every aspect of the 57mm gun's design in ways that no training ground could replicate. When American forces landed at Salerno on September 9, 1943, they brought with them the new anti-tank weapons that were supposed to solve the problems encountered in Tunisia. But the terrain around Salerno bore little resemblance to the open deserts of North Africa. The mountains rose steeply from the coastal plain, covered with dense vegetation and crisscrossed by ancient stone walls that channeled movement into predictable routes. German defenders had positioned their tanks and anti-tank guns to cover these natural avenues of approach, creating kill zones where American forces found themselves exposed at ranges where the 57mm gun struggled to be effective. Staff Sergeant Thomas Brennan commanded a gun crew from the 45th Infantry Division during the Salerno fighting, and his experience illustrated the challenges that would plague the weapon throughout the Italian campaign. His crew spent 3 days manhandling their 2,100-pound gun up a mountain road toward a German strongpoint that intelligence reports indicated was defended by Mark IV tanks. The pneumatic tires that worked well on paved roads proved inadequate on the rocky mountain paths. Without suspension, every bump and obstacle transmitted directly through the carriage, forcing the crew to lift the gun over obstacles rather than tow it. What should have been a 2-hour movement took most of a day. When they finally established a firing position overlooking the German position, Brennan discovered that his ammunition supply consisted entirely of armor-piercing rounds. The German strongpoint included infantry positions, machine gun nests, and fortified observation posts, none of which could be effectively engaged with armor-piercing ammunition. The rounds passed straight through stone walls without creating the explosive effect necessary to neutralize the defenders. Brennan's crew could engage tanks if they appeared, but against the actual targets facing them, the 57mm gun was nearly useless. The lack of high explosive ammunition created a persistent problem that affected every aspect of 57mm gun operations in Italy. Infantry commanders needed versatile weapons that could provide fire support against multiple target types, but the 57mm gun could only engage armoured vehicles effectively. This limitation forced commanders to make difficult choices about how to employ the weapons. Some kept their 57mm guns in reserve, using them only when German armour appeared. Others positioned them to support infantry advances despite the ammunition limitations, accepting reduced effectiveness in exchange for having heavy weapons available. The breakout from Anzio in May 1944 marked a turning point in 57mm gun employment. The flat terrain of the Anzio beachhead had allowed German forces to position their tanks at long ranges where they could engage American positions with relative impunity. American 57mm guns, restricted by their effective range and limited ammunition types, struggled to counter this threat, but when Allied forces finally broke through the German defensive line and began advancing north toward Rome, the tactical situation shifted in ways that favored the 57mm gun's capabilities. During the advance through central Italy in June 1944, Lieutenant James McCarthy's gun crew from the 36th Infantry Division encountered a German column retreating north along a narrow road flanked by steep hillsides. The Germans were moving in daylight, apparently believing that Allied forces were still too far behind to threaten them. McCarthy's crew had positioned their 57mm gun on a hillside overlooking the road, and from that vantage point they could engage German vehicles as they passed below. The engagement lasted approximately 15 minutes and demonstrated both the gun's effectiveness when properly employed and its continued limitations. McCarthy's crew destroyed 2 Mark IV tanks and 3 half-tracks, firing at ranges between 500 and 800 yards where their armor-piercing ammunition was most effective. The German column scattered after the initial hits, with vehicles attempting to reverse direction or find cover off the road. But several trucks and staff cars escaped because McCarthy's crew had no high-explosive ammunition to engage soft-skinned vehicles effectively. The armor-piercing rounds passed through the trucks without creating sufficient damage to stop them. By summer 1944, American factories had finally begun producing high-explosive ammunition for the 57mm gun in significant quantities. The M303 high-explosive shell entered production in March 1944, but distribution to units in Italy and preparation for the Normandy invasion took months. Most crews operating in Italy throughout the spring and early summer of 1944 continued to rely exclusively on armor-piercing ammunition or on captured British high-explosive rounds when they could be obtained. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944, brought the 57mm gun into the most intensive combat it would experience during the war. American airborne divisions landed behind German lines armed with British-manufactured 6-pounder guns on special lightweight carriages designed for airborne operations. These guns were technically 57mm weapons built to the same specifications as the American M1, but their specialized carriages made them easier to transport and deploy in the confined terrain of the Normandy bocage. The bocage country of Normandy consisted of small fields separated by thick hedgerows that had been growing for centuries. These hedgerows, called haies in French, were actually earthen banks, 4 to 6 feet high, topped with dense vegetation that formed natural defensive positions. German forces had fortified the hedgerows with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank guns, creating a defensive network that channeled American advances into predictable routes. Fighting in the bocage became a brutal contest of small unit actions where visibility rarely exceeded 100 yards and where heavy weapons often couldn't maneuver into effective firing positions. Sergeant First Class Robert Hutchinson commanded a 57mm gun crew from the 2nd Infantry Division during the early weeks of the Normandy campaign, and his experiences reflected the challenges facing anti-tank gunners in that terrain. The hedgerows restricted fields of fire to such short ranges that German tanks could approach within 200 yards before being detected. At those ranges, the 57mm gun could penetrate most German armor, but the crew had to survive the initial contact long enough to engage. Hutchinson's crew learned to position their gun at hedge intersections where multiple fields met, giving them several potential fields of fire rather than a single, narrow lane. They dug the gun into a depression that kept the barrel just above ground level, reducing its silhouette and making it harder for German observers to locate. They camouflaged the position with cut vegetation that was replaced daily to prevent it from withering and revealing the position. And they maintained a constant watch on all approaches, knowing that, in the bocage, survival depended on seeing the enemy first. On June 15, 1944, Hutchinson's position was engaged by a German Panther tank that appeared without warning at the end of a hedgerow lane approximately 300 yards distant. The Panther featured 80mm of sloped frontal armor that the 57mm gun could not reliably penetrate at that range. Hutchinson ordered his crew to hold fire and wait for the tank to turn, hoping to get a shot at the thinner side armor. The Panther advanced slowly, its commander apparently unaware of the American position. At 200 yards, the tank began turning to traverse its turret toward a different target. Hutchinson's gunner fired immediately, striking the Panther's side armor just behind the turret. The round penetrated the armor and detonated inside the tank. Smoke began pouring from the engine compartment. The Panther's crew attempted to evacuate, but German infantry supporting the tank opened fire on Hutchinson's position, forcing the Americans to take cover. The engagement ended with the Panther destroyed, but Hutchinson's crew forced to abandon their position under heavy infantry fire. They had accomplished their mission, destroying an enemy tank, but the tactical reality remained that the 57mm gun required favorable circumstances to be effective against the heaviest German armor. The most significant test of the 57mm gun's capabilities came during Operation Lüttich in August 1944, when German forces launched a major counterattack aimed at cutting off American units that had broken through German lines west of Mortain. Adolf Hitler personally ordered the attack, committing some of Germany's finest armored divisions, including the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. The objective was to drive west to Avranches on the coast, severing the supply lines of General George Patton's Third Army and potentially encircling multiple American divisions. The 30th Infantry Division, an Army National Guard unit nicknamed the Old Hickory Division, absorbed the main force of the German attack. The division had only recently arrived in the Mortain area, relieving the 1st Infantry Division, which had captured the town on August 3rd. The 30th Division's men dug into positions around Mortain. Without adequate maps of the area, and with little time to prepare defenses, their anti-tank weapons included 57mm guns positioned at key road junctions and on the dominant terrain feature east of town, Hill 314. The German attack began just after midnight on August 7th. The 2nd SS Panzer Division struck in 2 columns, north and south of Mortain, achieving tactical surprise, despite Allied intelligence having decoded German orders for the offensive. The southern column captured the command post of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment inside Mortain itself, but the main body of the battalion remained entrenched on Hill 314, surrounded and cut off. Approximately 700 American soldiers defended the hill, supported by several 57mm anti-tank guns and forward artillery observers, who could call fire on any German forces attempting to use the main road below. Staff Sergeant Miller Rhine commanded one of the 57mm gun positions defending the approaches to Mortain. His crew had positioned their weapon to cover a road junction south of town where German forces would have to pass to continue their advance westward. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 7th, Rhine heard the distinctive sound of tank engines and tracked vehicles approaching from the east. He ordered his crew to hold fire until the targets were clearly identified. As the first grey light of dawn illuminated the road, Rhine could see a column of German half-tracks and armoured cars moving toward his position. The 57mm gun opened fire at approximately 300 yards, destroying the lead vehicle and blocking the road. The German column halted, with vehicles attempting to reverse or find alternative routes. Rhine's crew maintained a steady rate of fire, engaging each vehicle as it appeared. They destroyed 3 SDKFZ, 2 51 half-tracks, 2 armoured cars, and several trucks before German infantry began manoeuvring to flank the American position. The engagement demonstrated the 57mm gun's effectiveness against lighter armoured vehicles at close range, but it also revealed the weapon's fundamental vulnerability when facing determined infantry attacks. The battle for Mortain continued for 6 days, from August 7th through August 12th. The German offensive failed to reach its objectives, stopped by a combination of determined American infantry defense, effective artillery support, and devastating Allied air attacks that destroyed dozens of German tanks. But for the men operating 57mm guns during those battles, the experience reinforced lessons that had been learned throughout the Italian and Normandy campaigns. The gun was effective against most German armour when it could engage at favourable ranges and angles. But it struggled against the heaviest German tanks like the Panther and Tiger, and the gun crews were extremely vulnerable when German infantry could close with their positions. Contemporary accounts from Mortain consistently described the 57mm guns as inadequate against German heavy armour. One report from the National World War II Museum noted that American forward units fought furiously, but their 57mm anti-tank guns proved nearly useless against the heavy German tanks, forcing soldiers to face down the armoured threats at close quarters with bazookas and any other weapons they could find. This assessment reflected a reality that 57mm gun crews had been experiencing since the weapon's introduction. Against the newest and most heavily armoured German tanks, the guns simply lacked sufficient penetrating power at combat ranges. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945 provided the final comprehensive test of the 57mm gun under the worst possible conditions. German forces launched a surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, attacking in winter weather that grounded Allied air support and restricted movement along muddy, snow-covered roads. American forces, thinly spread along what had been considered a quiet sector, found themselves facing concentrated German armor attacks spearheaded by Panther and Tiger tanks that the 57mm gun could not reliably penetrate. The tactical limitations became operational disasters during the Bulge. 57mm gun crews attempting to reposition their weapons to meet German thrusts found that the guns were too heavy to move quickly through the muddy conditions. The 2,100-pound weapons bogged down in snow and mud, requiring tractors or trucks to tow them, and both were in short supply as American forces struggled to maintain supply lines to surrounded units. Crews that managed to establish firing positions often found that German tanks engaged them from ranges beyond the 57mm gun's effective penetration distance, methodically destroying American positions with their superior long-range firepower. The casualty statistics from December 1944 told a grim story. Anti-tank units equipped with 57mm guns suffered 26% casualties during that month, compared to 6 to 8% casualties per month during the Normandy fighting. This dramatic increase reflected both the intensity of the German offensive and the fundamental mismatch between the 57mm gun's capabilities and the threats it faced. After-action reports from 1st Army units repeatedly noted that the bazooka was preferred as an infantry anti-tank weapon during the Bulge, despite its much shorter range, because it could be carried by individual soldiers and positioned quickly in response to developing threats. By the end of the Battle of the Bulge in January 1945, the 57mm gun's reputation within the American Army had shifted dramatically from the optimism that accompanied its introduction in spring 1943. The weapon had proven effective against medium German tanks and lighter armored vehicles when employed under favorable conditions. It had demonstrated reliability and mechanical durability that allowed crews to maintain their weapons even under harsh field conditions, and it had achieved notable successes in specific engagements where its capabilities matched the tactical situation. But the gun had also demonstrated serious limitations that could not be overcome through training or tactics. Its weight made it difficult to maneuver in restrictive terrain or adverse weather. Its penetration was insufficient against the frontal armor of German heavy tanks at combat ranges. Its lack of high explosive and canister ammunition for most of the war severely limited its usefulness in infantry support roles, and perhaps most critically, its static nature made it vulnerable in an era when mechanized warfare increasingly favored mobility over fixed defensive positions. The statistical record supported these tactical assessments. During the fighting in Italy, American forces lost 259 57mm guns, more than any other anti-tank weapon type deployed in that theater. This high loss rate reflected both the intensity of combat in Italy and the vulnerability of towed anti-tank guns when facing mobile German armor and aggressive German infantry tactics. Units equipped with self-propelled tank destroyers reported higher kill rates at lower cost in both equipment and personnel, reinforcing the growing consensus that towed anti-tank guns represented obsolete technology in modern mechanized warfare. The weapon remained in American service through the end of the war in May 1945, equipping infantry division anti-tank companies throughout the final campaigns in Germany, but its role had shifted from being the primary anti-tank weapon to being one element in a combined arms approach that increasingly relied on bazookas for close-range engagement, tank destroyers for mobile anti-tank capability, and artillery for long-range suppression. The 57mm gun had become a supplementary weapon rather than the solution to the anti-tank problem that its introduction in 1943 had promised. Staff Sergeant William Horvath, whose crew had abandoned their 37mm gun under fire in Tunisia in May 1943, survived the war and returned home to Pennsylvania in October 1945. He had spent the final year of the war operating a 57mm gun with the 804th Tank Destroyer Battalion participating in campaigns from Normandy through the Rhineland. When asked years later about the differences between the 37mm and 57mm guns, Horvath provided an assessment that captured the weapon's complex legacy. The 57mm gun could kill tanks that the 37mm couldn't touch, he said. At 500 yards, we could penetrate armor that would have stopped the 37mm cold, but the gun was heavy, hard to move, and we never had the right ammunition when we needed it. Against Panthers and Tigers, we learned to wait for side shots or let them pass and hope the tank destroyers could deal with them. It was a better weapon than what we had in Tunisia, but it wasn't the weapon we needed by the time Germany was building Tigers and Panthers. This measured evaluation reflected the consensus that emerged among American forces during the final year of the war. The 57mm gun represented a significant improvement over the inadequate 37mm gun that had proven useless against German armor in Tunisia. It had provided American infantry divisions with an anti-tank capability that was effective against the majority of German armored vehicles they encountered, and it had demonstrated mechanical reliability and durability that allowed it to function under the harshest combat conditions, from the jungles of the Pacific to the frozen forests of the Ardennes. But the gun had entered service at precisely the moment when German tank development was accelerating, producing vehicles that tested the weapon's capabilities to their absolute limit and often exceeded them. The tactical doctrine that emphasized fixed defensive positions was giving way to mobile warfare that favored self-propelled weapons over towed guns, and the assumption that a single weapon could serve as both an anti-tank gun and an infantry support weapon proved incorrect when ammunition shortages prevented the 57mm gun from fulfilling the latter role throughout most of its service life. The title that suggested the 57mm gun could pierce 88mm armor plates at 2,000 yards represented the kind of exaggeration that weapons often accumulated in popular memory. The actual penetration figures were more modest but still significant within the weapon's proper context. At 1,000 yards, the gun could penetrate approximately 71 millimeters of armor, sufficient to defeat the side armor of most German tanks, but insufficient against the frontal armor of heavy tanks at that range. At 2,000 yards, penetration dropped to approximately 40 millimeters, adequate only against the lightest armored vehicles. These limitations didn't make the weapon useless. They made it a specialized tool that required careful employment by well-trained crews who understood both its capabilities and its restrictions. In the hands of soldiers like Staff Sergeant Miller Rhine at Mortain, who used the gun's strengths while compensating for its weaknesses, the 57mm proved itself a valuable weapon that contributed to Allied victory. In situations where crews expected the gun to perform beyond its actual capabilities, disappointment and casualties were the inevitable result. The final production numbers told their own story about the weapon's place in American military procurement. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced 15,637 57mm guns. Peak production came in 1943 with 5,856 units, but production declined thereafter as the Army shifted emphasis toward self-propelled tank destroyers, and as it became clear that even heavier weapons would be needed to counter German tank development. By 1945, production had dropped to minimal levels as existing stocks were sufficient to equip the diminishing number of units still requiring the weapons. After the war ended, the 57mm gun remained in American service for only a brief period. The Korean War saw limited use of the weapon, primarily in defensive positions where its weight was less of a disadvantage, but the gun was clearly obsolete by 1950, outclassed by more modern anti-tank weapons, and rendered irrelevant by the shift toward mechanized warfare. Most of the guns produced during World War II were scrapped or transferred to Allied nations during the 1950s, marking the end of an era when towed anti-tank guns represented a viable solution to armored threats. The lessons learned from 57mm gun operations influenced American anti-tank doctrine for decades. The importance of ammunition diversity was recognized, leading to greater emphasis on developing multiple ammunition types for new weapons from the outset. The limitations of towed guns in mobile warfare accelerated the shift toward self-propelled systems, and the recognition that armor development would continue to outpace anti-tank gun capabilities led to greater emphasis on missile systems that could provide consistent penetration regardless of target armor thickness. For the men who served the 57mm guns from Tunisia to Germany, the weapon remained a complex memory of a tool that was sometimes effective, sometimes inadequate, and always challenging to employ under combat conditions. They had learned to respect the gun's mechanical reliability while acknowledging its tactical limitations. They had achieved successes when circumstances allowed and had survived failures when the weapon proved insufficient, and they had contributed to a collective understanding that would shape anti-tank warfare for generations to come. The story of the 57mm gun was never about a weak weapon becoming strong or about proving skeptics wrong through superior performance. It was about the difficult reality that war forced armies to use available weapons even when those weapons were imperfect, and about the soldiers who made those imperfect weapons work as well as possible under impossible conditions. The gun didn't pierce 88mm plates at 2,000 yards, but it did help defeat German armor when employed intelligently by crews who understood what it could and couldn't accomplish. And in the end, that more modest truth mattered more than any exaggerated claim. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.